Donovan Mitchell is going to get traded from the Utah Jazz. All the signs point towards it, whether it be Utah trading away Rudy Gobert to try and restructure their roster, get future draft picks, whether it be the ESPN report that the Jazz are now listening to trade offers for Mitchell, or the years and years of connections between Mitchell and the New York Knicks. However, I feel like we're having issues right now really pinpointing what exactly the value of Donovan Mitchell is in a trade, and that is what we're going to be figuring out in today's video. Really quickly though, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, PrizePicks. PrizePicks is a great way to play player props. I know a lot of you guys enjoyed using it during Summer League, as I did as well. But there are still plenty of great opportunities for PrizePicks all summer long, whether it be baseball season, whether it be potential NFL future stuff, esports. There's all kinds of things you can get into on PrizePicks. Now, if you've never done it before, how it works is you download the app and you pick between 2 and 5 players and try and guess what you think their performance is going to be like for baseball, for basketball, for football. It can be all kinds of different stats, and you just pick over under for individual players, and you build your list between 2 to 5 players, and the more you get correct, the more cash you win. And if you're someone like me that's into, a lot of different sports, you can mix and match. You can do some esports stuff. You can do some baseball stuff. You can throw some NFL futures in there as well. All of it can work on PrizePicks. So if you're interested in PrizePicks, I have an offer for you. If you click the link in the description or use code SPORTING at PrizePicks, they will match 100% of your deposit up to $100. Again, that link is in the description. The code is SPORTING, 100% deposit match up to $100 on PrizePicks. I'm also interested to see some of y'all's PrizePicks over on Twitter, so send them to me over there. And thank you again to PrizePicks for sponsoring this video. So we begin with the most obvious Donovan Mitchell trade location, and that is the New York Knicks. There's 2 different ways to view this situation, and they both revolve around RJ Barrett's inclusion in the trade. I know where I stand on this, but I'm interested to see what you guys have to say down in the comment section below. If you are the Jazz, do you want RJ Barrett? And if you're the Knicks, are you willing to give him up in exchange for Donovan Mitchell? In this first deal, RJ Barrett is not involved in the trade. Now, there's been some reports about this, that either the Knicks are going to refuse to include RJ Barrett in the deal, or that Utah doesn't actually want RJ Barrett. And I'd be wondering, why would they not want RJ? He's young, he's an asset. Well, he's gonna be an expensive player here in a few seasons. He's nearing the end of his rookie contract, and he's going to get a sizable rookie extension. And given what Utah traded Rudy Gobert for, mostly role players on movable contracts and future picks, the thought is maybe that is Utah's plan. They just want cheaper players, they want role players, and they want draft picks, and they don't want to pay RJ Barrett potentially $25+ million a year, which I think is a realistic extension for him. So in this case, they're trading Donovan Mitchell in exchange for Derrick Rose, Cam Reddish, Quentin Grimes, Obi Toppin, and Emmanuel Quickley. And there's 1 first-round pick here. That's just a placeholder for however many first-round picks you want to include in the deal. 3, 4 swaps, no swaps, whatever the case may be. And Rose is just there for salary reasons. He's the better contract for Utah to trade for rather than Evan Fournier to try and make the money work. It's a year shorter and it's cheaper. Now, if you're asking me, I want RJ Barrett if I'm the Utah Jazz, and you're not getting Donovan Mitchell without RJ Barrett being involved in the trade. I want a player that I can point to and say, that's who I got for Donovan Mitchell. I don't really care about the extension coming up for RJ Barrett because he's improved every single year that he's been in the league. He's still very young. He's still going to be an asset, even if he is making $25+ million a year. And I just don't understand why you wouldn't want a positive asset in a trade in exchange for Donovan Mitchell. I don't understand that mindset. They're going to get picks. They're probably going to get 1 or 2 other interesting young role players on their roster, but I want a guy. I want a player. And unless you view RJ Barrett at $25 million a year plus as a negative asset, there's no reason that he shouldn't be in this trade if you're looking at it from the Jazz perspective. And here's the other part of this that people are continuing to forget. Danny Ainge is in charge in Utah. He made the Rudy Gobert trade. He went over from Boston. He is going to get maximum value for Donovan Mitchell. He's not going to do the Knicks any favors. He's not going to just look and say, well, I mean, it's where Mitchell really wants to go, so I guess we'll get 70% of his value to trade him there. That's not how he operates. If he wants RJ Barrett and the Knicks don't give him RJ Barrett, they're not getting Donovan Mitchell. That's just where I'm standing. Now, I can understand the argument of not wanting him, just wanting the cheap guys, but to me, the Donovan Mitchell trade to the Knicks should look like this: Rose, Barrett, Toppin, however many picks you want to throw in there. And then from there, New York is looking at a situation where it's not the final step for them. I don't think anybody's going to argue that Donovan Mitchell is a number 1 on a championship team. But even if you do give up RJ Barrett, you have Mitchell, you have Brunson, questionable defensively, but still. And then you have Julius Randle, Mitchell Robinson, some other pieces on this roster. And that isn't the final piece, but having Mitchell there gives them so much value and really legitimizes them, I should say, as a potential team of the future. You could be 1 star away. You could add 1 one more player alongside Donovan Mitchell and be looking at a finals team in New York, which they haven't been remotely close to in a very, very long time. It's honestly pretty similar to when they tried to bring in Carmelo the first time and were successful. They just unfortunately brought in Amari Stoudemire to play alongside him. And in this case, hopefully if they do get Mitchell, they do a little bit better job of pairing him with someone that actually makes sense and should stay healthy long term. But that is the mindset for New York, is even if you do have to give up RJ, you still have some stuff, whether it be, most of your picks left or some young guys, whatever the case may be, to try and be involved in getting another star down the road. Now that I think is the critical part of this if you are the Knicks, because if you only get Mitchell, if you give up, honestly, either of these trade packages, if you only get Mitchell and there's no other guy in the future, then you're a play-in team. Like, I think it's, even with Donovan Mitchell being added, it's hard to see this Knicks roster as, a consistent top 6 team in the Eastern Conference. The East is very good. There's a lot of really good teams, and making a Mitchell trade, if there isn't something else potentially in the works down the road, in my opinion, actually doesn't make a ton of sense, because again, it doesn't really legitimize you as championship contenders unless you get somebody else. I think Mitchell to New York in certain contexts with certain trades makes a ton of sense for both sides. The Jazz get value in terms of those draft picks. The Knicks have a ton they can give up. They can give up 3 first-round picks, and none of which being their own, in exchange for Mitchell. And I think, as I said, for the Knicks, considering certain circumstances and certain contexts, it does also make sense for them. But they're not the only Donovan Mitchell team. I think that's the important thing to point out here. It is not just New York. Another interesting team for me are the Toronto Raptors, a team that we've talked about a lot with Kevin Durant trades. In this scenario, they would be giving up Khem Birch, OG Anunoby, Armani Brooks, and 2 first-round picks. Now, Birch and Brooks are just there for salary reasons, so basically it's OG Anunoby and 2 firsts. The reasoning here for Toronto is similar to the Kevin Durant thing, just a different player and someone that's younger. You upgrade the talent level of your roster. You have a couple of wings, so losing OG Anunoby isn't a huge deal. You've still got Scotty Barnes, still got Gary Trent, you've got Siakam, of course, and then you have Van Vliet and Mitchell. And even though Siakam isn't going to be your full-time 5, there's a couple of different lineup combinations there that are really exciting, and then you can go out and try and get like a bargain bin 5 to add to this roster alongside Boucher. And then suddenly Toronto's looking really interesting. Now, of course, you always have to consider, does Donovan Mitchell want to be in Toronto? Presumably he wants to go to one of these bigger markets, but just in terms of a value in exchange for Donovan Mitchell, this to me feels pretty fair. The way that I'm really thinking about him is he's like 24-year-old Bradley Beal is basically what Donovan Mitchell is. He's not going to be a number 1 guy. He's not Luka. He's not Tatum. He's not one of those young stars that can be the number 1 guy in a finals team. But if you get him and another player, like, he's a really, really good scorer and someone that has had some big time playoff performances as well. And if you build a structure around him that makes sense, like they have in Toronto, he can be a very, very successful player. And I think that would be, from a team perspective, just like it would be with Durant, a really interesting situation and context in which to add Donovan Mitchell. Now, one team I want to mention here that we talk about all the time, I feel like we talk about the Raptors and Miami together all the time, or the Miami Heat. There's no Donovan Mitchell trade that involves Tyler Hero, Duncan Robinson, and a pick, in my opinion. Like, that's just like we talked about with Durant. I don't think Hero and Robinson and stuff is enough to make a Mitchell trade happen just because they want to do the Heat a favor. Danny does not have a great relationship with Pat Riley in terms of wanting to do business with him in the first place. I don't think the Heat are a realistic destination. I think Hero is a really polarizing player, and it's very possible Utah doesn't view him as like a future all-star type player the way that maybe some teams around the league do. And then you also have to include some wild card Mitchell trade teams in here as well, because it can't just be the Knicks, right? Like, you have to kind of drive up the price on them a little bit. So in this case, the Hornets are getting Donovan Mitchell in exchange for, in addition to Bojan Bogdanovic, in exchange for Hayward, Washington, McDaniels, Kai Jones, Book Knight, and 2 firsts. Similar structure, honestly, to what the Knicks were trying to do without RJ Barrett. Of course, Gordon Hayward's contract is there, but he has to be there in order to kind of match salaries. They can swing him somewhere else, try and get value. But it's basically some role player young guys and 2 first-round picks in exchange for Donovan Mitchell and the salary relief of getting off of Bogdanovic. And then again, you can kind of spin Hayward somewhere else. And then lastly would be the Chicago Bulls. They would trade Lonzo. The medical stuff on Lonzo right now is not looking fantastic. I don't really know if he's an asset, but his salary kind of has to be here. Kobe White, Patrick Williams, and 2 first-round picks as well. And to me, like, all these structures make sense. Like, they look like something that if it was actually reported by ESPN as the actual trade that went through, it wouldn't shock me. The problem is, I think this is all heading to Donovan Mitchell in New York. I would say, unfortunately, because that just feels like just another guy forcing his way to where he wants to go. But as I say all the time in videos, like, I want the Knicks to be good, and I think getting Mitchell would be a good first step to that. And so despite these other teams being involved, I think ultimately we're going to circle back to one of those first 2 trades that were discussed discussed in the beginning of the video. If you asked me to make a prediction, I would say that Donovan Mitchell is going to end up in New York and RJ Barrett is going to end up in Utah. Danny Ainge is going to want a player back that has actual value, and he's going to want those picks. The Knicks have the best combination of those two things amongst places that it is realistic to expect Donovan Mitchell to want to go. You could argue RJ Barrett is a better asset than Tyler Hero, and certainly New York has better draft assets than what Miami can offer, and those are the two big markets that are in play right now for Donovan Mitchell. Unless you want to throw some Brooklyn stuff in here, and given the fact that it seems like they're probably just going to run it back with KD and Kyrie, and then of course the Ben Simmons thing, Mitchell and Simmons can't be on the same team because of the rookie extension thing. All of that being considered, to me, points to an RJ Barrett, some role players, and some picks package being sent back to Utah in exchange for Donovan Mitchell, and then we'll have to see what New York does from there. Defensively, Mitchell and Brunson, it's not fantastic. Randall's not a great defender either. They got to hope that Mitchell Robinson is going to block a ton of shots at the rim. I don't know if Tibbs is the guy for that team. Once you start moving more towards like star power and trying to attract stars, I don't think that Tibbs is necessarily the guy that stars are really going to want to go and be yelled at and held accountable by Tibbs. I think he's much more of an up and coming young team kind of coach rather than like, hey, let's bring in these kinds of stars and cater to them, which I think is ultimately the path that New York would be heading down if they were to trade for Donovan Mitchell. And I think ultimately that is where we're landing. But I just wanted to kind of workshop a little bit what we all think collectively about what Donovan Mitchell's value is, what kind of trade assets Utah can realistically expect in return. And so not only this video, but hopefully the comment section as well can shed some light on what a potential Donovan Mitchell trade should look like.